Sarah had always dreamed of becoming a ballerina, ever since she could remember. Her family didn't quite understand her obsession with dance, especially ballet, which was so demanding and different from anything else they knew. Yet, every morning before school, she'd practice pirouettes in front of the living room mirror, imagining herself performing on the grandest stages. She'd make up routines in her bedroom, dancing to classical music on her old, scratched-up radio, her heart soaring as her feet glided across the floor. At 17, Sarah had made it into one of the most prestigious ballet academies in the country. It was a place known for its fierce competition, where only the best survived and thrived. She'd worked hard to get there, taking every class, pushing her body to the limit, and keeping a singular focus on her goal, to be the best ballerina she could be. But from the moment she stepped into the academy, Sarah realized that her dream was not going to be as simple as she'd hoped. Unlike the other dancers, most of whom had the typical ballerina body, long, lean, and slender, Sarah's frame was different. She was curvier, with fuller hips and a stronger build. She knew she wasn't built like the others, but she never let that stop her. She loved ballet too much. Despite the challenges, Sarah held on to the belief that talent was what mattered most, and she worked harder than anyone else in the academy. But the pressure was immense, and as weeks passed, she couldn't help but notice the subtle glances, the whispers behind her back, and the way the instructors sometimes looked past her, favoring the slimmer dancers who seemed to fit the mold of a ballerina more perfectly. It was like she was invisible, and the harder she tried to prove herself, the more isolated she felt. But she didn't give up. One cold December morning, Sarah arrived at rehearsal early, determined to make an impression. Her muscles ached from the previous day's practice, but she had learned to push through the pain, to keep going despite the weariness. As she stretched at the bar, Sarah could hear the other dancers chatting behind her. She couldn't make out every word, but there was one voice that stood out, the voice of Emma, one of the most talented and popular dancers at the academy. Emma was tall, graceful, and had the slender physique that most ballet dancers were expected to have. Sarah had always admired Emma's skill, though she'd sensed some jealousy in her from the start. Today, however, the whispers were louder. As Sarah turned her head slightly, she saw Emma talking to a small group of dancers, her voice dripping with a venomous undertone. "You know, it's just so hard to watch Sarah dance like that," Emma said, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "I mean, I get it, she's trying, but I don't think ballet is for someone her size. Don't you think she'd be better off doing something else, something less demanding?" The group of dancers around Emma giggled, their laughter stinging Sarah's ears. Sarah's heart sank as she tried to focus on her stretch, but her body felt frozen. Emma's words echoed in her mind, each syllable like a cruel reminder of her insecurities. She had heard things like this before, of course, but never so openly, never so directly. For a moment, everything felt like it was closing in around her. She wanted to scream, to shout at Emma, to demand respect, but she couldn't. She couldn't let anyone see how much it hurt. With trembling hands, Sarah adjusted her position at the bar, trying to ignore the group behind her. But the damage had been done. Emma's words were now imprinted in her mind, and they seemed to haunt every movement she made. She glanced nervously at the instructor, who was preparing for the day's lesson, but she noticed that they hadn't heard Emma's words. They were focused on the routine, as they always were. Sarah forced herself to smile, trying to push through the awkwardness, but it was impossible to ignore the weight of the moment. As the class started, Sarah found herself stumbling over steps that she'd performed perfectly 100 times before. Her legs felt heavier, the floor beneath her felt unforgiving, and every gaze seemed to scrutinize her every move. It was like she was no longer dancing for herself, but for the approval of everyone else, to prove that she deserved to be here, despite what Emma had said. Each pirouette felt like a battle, each leap felt harder than the last. Her body, which had always been her greatest asset in the dance world, now felt like an obstacle, a source of shame. Emma, ever the graceful one, seemed to glide through the movements effortlessly, but Sarah couldn't take her eyes off her. Emma's grace, her poise, her perfect form, it all seemed like a cruel reminder of what Sarah could never be. The class continued, but Sarah's focus was shattered. She could barely concentrate on her steps. Every time she glanced at Emma, the words rang in her ears, "Ballet isn't for someone her size." The rest of the day passed in a blur of disappointment. Sarah could barely meet the eyes of the other dancers, especially Emma. She wanted to confront her, to tell her how hurtful her words were, but she couldn't bring herself to. Emma had always been the one everyone admired, the one whose opinion mattered, and who was she to challenge that? Sarah was just the girl who didn't fit in, the girl who would never have the right body for ballet. As the class ended and the dancers filtered out of the room, Sarah lingered behind, pretending to gather her things. But inside, she was falling apart. What was she doing here? Was it really worth it to keep pushing herself when it felt like everyone else was right, when she was always going to be the odd one out? For the first time, she began to doubt everything she had worked for, everything she believed in. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe she didn't belong here after all. As Sarah left the studio that day, the icy wind cutting through her coat, she couldn't shake the feeling of hopelessness. She had spent so long trying to fit in, trying to prove she deserved a place among these dancers, but now, everything felt so much harder. Emma's words had done more than just bruise her, they had shaken her confidence to its core. But she wasn't sure what to do about it. She wasn't sure if she even had the strength to. In the days that followed, Sarah felt herself retreating further into herself, consumed by the sting of Emma's words. The mirror at the ballet academy had always been a tool for improvement, a way to measure her growth, but now it seemed like an enemy. She avoided looking at her reflection as much as possible, fearing that the sight of her body would confirm everything Emma had said. The more she thought about it, the more she began to doubt her place in ballet altogether. The cruel whisper of, "You don't belong here," echoed relentlessly in her mind, drowning out the encouraging thoughts she once had. She stopped speaking to her fellow dancers, no longer participating in the light banter that once filled the studio after practice. She withdrew into herself, focusing only on the steps, the moves, the routines. But no matter how much she practiced, it never felt enough. She could feel eyes on her at every rehearsal, could sense the judgment behind every glance, even if they weren't directly aimed at her. The sense of being an outsider grew with each passing day, and the joy she once found in dancing faded into something forced and mechanical. Every class felt like an examination, every pirouette an attempt to prove that she was worthy. Sarah's world outside the academy became a blur, too. She stopped hanging out with her friends, avoiding social gatherings or even simple moments of relaxation. She didn't want to risk anyone asking her what was wrong, didn't want to hear what they might say about her body, about her dancing. At home, she became consumed by worry. The kitchen, once a place where she would bake cookies or enjoy family meals, had turned into a place of anxiety. She started cutting back on her meals, thinking maybe, just maybe, if she could lose some weight, if she could look more like the other dancers, it would make everything better. Every day, she pushed herself harder, running extra miles in the cold, doing squats and stretches until her muscles burned with fatigue. But the more she worked, the worse she felt. She was starving her body, both literally and emotionally, in an attempt to fit into an image that wasn't even hers. Yet, despite the deep loneliness, there was still a small part of Sarah that refused to give up entirely. Every time she stepped into the studio, she tried to remind herself of why she started this journey. It wasn't just about fitting in or pleasing others, it was about expressing herself, about the love she had for ballet, and the hope that she could one day perform with the grace and beauty she admired in the great ballerinas. But that voice, the one that had once been full of hope, now seemed faint, drowned out by the relentless negativity. One evening, after an especially grueling class, Sarah found herself alone in the studio. Everyone else had left, but she couldn't bring herself to go home just yet. The place felt like a safe haven, even if it was filled with the ghosts of unspoken words and missed opportunities. She took off her shoes, letting the coolness of the wooden floor seep through her tired feet, and began to stretch slowly, just to calm her thoughts. Her body ached, but the familiar routine of stretching was a small comfort. It was the one thing that didn't ask anything from her. It was just her and the floor, just movement and breath. As Sarah bent into a deep stretch, she heard a voice from the doorway. "You've been working harder than anyone, you know." It was Lucas, the quiet boy who had been at the academy for a couple of years but always kept to himself. He was a bit of a loner, but Sarah had always respected his dedication and the way he danced with such natural ease. He wasn't the tallest or the slimmest, but there was something undeniably magnetic about him when he was in motion. She never thought much of him before, never really spoke to him outside of practice, but now, as he stood in the doorway watching her, Sarah felt a pang of relief that someone had noticed her. "I didn't mean to intrude," Lucas said softly, his hands in his pockets, his expression neutral. "I was just leaving, but I saw you here and thought I'd say something. I've seen how hard you've been pushing yourself lately. It's impressive." Sarah blinked, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to receiving praise, especially from someone as focused as Lucas. "Thanks," she said quietly, unsure whether to meet his eyes or focus on the floor. "But I'm not sure it's working. I don't think I'm meant to be here." Lucas walked into the room, closing the door behind him. He didn't look like he was going to give up easily. "You know, I've been watching you. You're really good. You might not be the same as everyone else, but that's not a bad thing. You've got a strength that no one else has. You don't need to fit into some mold. Ballet doesn't care about your size, it's about how you move, how you express yourself." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And right now, you're holding yourself back." The words felt like a light in the darkness, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, Sarah looked up at him, truly seeing him for the first time. He wasn't the one people admired or talked about, but maybe that's what made his words more genuine. He wasn't offering false hope, he was offering something real. "You're saying that even though I'm not like the others, I still belong?" she asked, her voice shaky. Lucas nodded, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Absolutely. You've got more than enough talent. Don't let anyone, especially Emma, make you feel like you don't belong. If ballet is what you love, then keep fighting for it. Don't let them take that from you." The weight of Lucas's words hung in the air long after he left. His quiet confidence had sparked something in Sarah, something she hadn't felt in a long time. A small flame of hope flickered inside her, and for the first time in a while, she started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the problem. Maybe the problem was the toxic culture she was trying to fit into. She didn't need to change herself to be worthy of ballet, she needed to accept herself, as she was, and let her dance speak for who she truly was. But there was still a long road ahead. Emma's words, though harsh, had planted a seed of doubt that Sarah knew she would have to confront. She couldn't keep letting them linger in her mind. She couldn't keep allowing them to control her. It was time for a change, but Sarah wasn't sure yet what that change would look like. She only knew one thing for sure: she couldn't keep dancing in the shadows of everyone else. She had to start dancing for herself. The days after Lucas's conversation with Sarah felt like a slow, but steady, shift in her perspective. The next morning, she entered the academy with a renewed sense of purpose. She could still hear the taunts in her mind, the echoes of Emma's cruel words, but now they no longer held the same power over her. She was determined to stop shrinking herself, to stop trying to fit into a mold that wasn't meant for her. It wasn't easy, not by any means. Every day, she had to remind herself to keep going, to trust her body, and to believe in her abilities. But with every passing hour spent at the bar, every leap and pirouette, Sarah felt herself growing stronger. At first, she focused on the simple things, improving her technique, refining her form. It wasn't about impressing anyone anymore. It wasn't about fitting into the perfection that the academy seemed to demand. It was about expressing herself, allowing her emotions and her experiences to flow through her movements. For the first time, she danced not with fear of judgment, but with the freedom to just be herself. But even as Sarah made strides in her personal journey, the rest of the academy didn't seem to change. The other dancers continued their whispers, their judging eyes still lingering on her every movement. Some of them, like Emma, made it clear that they didn't think she belonged. But Sarah no longer let it hurt. She refused to let their opinions control her. She focused on herself, on her own growth, rather than on their shallow expectations. One day, as Sarah was leaving class, she saw Emma at the front of the studio, surrounded by a group of dancers, all laughing and chatting. Sarah tried to ignore them, but Emma's voice sliced through the air like a knife. "You know," Emma said, loud enough for Sarah to hear, "there's no way she'll ever make it as a professional dancer. She's just too heavy." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. She froze for a moment, her hand gripping the doorframe as she fought to keep her composure. It was as if the universe had thrown her right back into the very thing she was trying to escape, the pain of being judged for her body, for not looking the way everyone thought she should. But instead of retreating, instead of giving in to the old insecurities, something within Sarah snapped. She walked into the room with her head held high, her back straight, and her eyes locked onto Emma. The room fell silent as she approached the group. "You don't know anything about me," Sarah said calmly, her voice firm but controlled. "You don't know my story, my struggles, or my journey. And you certainly don't get to decide whether I belong here or not." Emma's expression faltered for a moment, surprise flickering in her eyes. But she quickly regained her composure and shrugged dismissively. "Please," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We all know that ballet is about more than just being able to dance. It's about looking a certain way, having the right body. And you just don't have it." The words were harsh, but this time, they didn't have the power to break Sarah. She stood tall, taking a deep breath before speaking again. "Ballet is about strength, grace, and perseverance. It's not about fitting into a certain image. It's about your love for the art, your passion for the dance, and your ability to move people. And I can do that, whether you like it or not." The tension in the room was palpable, but instead of shrinking back, Sarah stood her ground. "I don't need your approval, Emma. I'm here for me, not for you. And if you can't respect that, then maybe it's time to stop pretending that your opinion matters to me." With those words, Sarah turned and walked out of the room, feeling a surge of empowerment that she hadn't felt in ages. She didn't need Emma's validation, or anyone else's for that matter. She was done seeking approval. She was done allowing herself to be defined by anyone else's standards of beauty or success. As Sarah stepped outside into the cool evening air, a sense of freedom washed over her. It was as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She didn't need to fight for a place in ballet anymore, she already had one. She just needed to believe in herself and keep moving forward. The path ahead would still be difficult. She would still face challenges and doubters, but now she knew she had the strength to overcome them. The following week, the academy held a major performance, and Sarah was given a solo role. It wasn't the lead part, but it was still an honor, one that she had earned through her hard work and dedication. As she stood backstage, waiting for her turn, her nerves were almost overwhelming. But instead of the usual anxiety, this time, she felt a sense of calm. She had nothing to prove to anyone. She was there for herself. She took a deep breath, feeling the beat of the music in her chest, and stepped onto the stage. The lights shone down on her, and for the first time, Sarah didn't try to conform to anyone else's expectations. She danced with everything she had, her heart pouring out through each movement. She let the music guide her, and her body followed, fluid and free. Every step felt like it was a part of her, an expression of everything she had fought for. When the performance ended, the audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't the applause that mattered to Sarah. It was the feeling of self-acceptance, of knowing that she had danced for herself and no one else. That night, as she stood in the dressing room, sweat dripping from her brow and a smile on her face, Sarah realized that she had truly found her place. Ballet wasn't about fitting into a mold or meeting anyone's standards, it was about finding her own voice and letting it shine. And for the first time, she believed in the strength of her own voice. From that moment on, Sarah's journey in ballet was no longer defined by the opinions of others. She stopped seeking approval and started dancing for the sheer joy of it. She knew there would still be obstacles, but now, she was ready to face them with the confidence that came from within. And as for Emma, Sarah no longer cared. She had finally learned that the only opinion that truly mattered was her own. As Sarah stepped outside into the cool evening air, a sense of freedom washed over her. It was as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She didn't need to fight for a place in ballet anymore, she already had one. She just needed to believe in herself and keep moving forward. The path ahead would still be difficult. She would still face challenges and doubters, but now she knew she had the strength to overcome them. The following week, the Academy held a major performance, and Sarah was given a solo role. It wasn't the lead part, but it was still an honor, one that she had earned through her hard work and dedication. As she stood backstage, waiting for her turn, her nerves were almost overwhelming. But instead of the usual anxiety, this time, she felt a sense of calm. She had nothing to prove to anyone. She was there for herself. She took a deep breath, feeling the beat of the music in her chest, and stepped onto the stage. The lights shone down on her, and for the first time, Sarah didn't try to conform to anyone else's expectations. She danced with everything she had, her heart pouring out through each movement. She let the music guide her, and her body followed, fluid and free. Every step felt like it was a part of her, an expression of everything she had fought for. When the performance ended, the audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't the applause that mattered to Sarah. It was the feeling of self-acceptance, of knowing that she had danced for herself and no one else. That night, as she stood in the dressing room, sweat dripping from her brow and a smile on her face, Sarah realized that she had truly found her place. Ballet wasn't about fitting into a mold or meeting anyone's standards, it was about finding her own voice and letting it shine. And for the first time, she believed in the strength of her own voice. From that moment on, Sarah's journey in ballet was no longer defined by the opinions of others. She stopped seeking approval and started dancing for the sheer joy of it. She knew there would still be obstacles, but now, she was ready to face them with the confidence that came from within. And as for Emma, Sarah no longer cared. She had finally learned that the only opinion that truly mattered was her own. Weeks passed, and Sarah's transformation continued both inside and outside of the ballet studio. Her confidence grew steadily, like a plant stretching toward the sunlight. She danced with more purpose, more passion, and, most importantly, with more freedom. Every movement felt like an act of self-expression, a declaration that she was no longer afraid of judgment. The echo of Emma's harsh words had faded into a distant memory, replaced by the steady rhythm of Sarah's own heartbeat. The Academy's atmosphere started to shift, too. The other dancers, who had once regarded Sarah with a mixture of skepticism and silent judgment, began to take notice of the changes in her. Her movements had become smoother, more expressive, more captivating. The fluidity in her body mirrored the newfound sense of inner peace she was developing. No longer focused on proving herself to anyone, she was able to truly let go and dance in a way that felt natural and authentic. One afternoon, as Sarah was practicing in the corner of the studio, she noticed the familiar presence of Emma watching her from a distance. Emma's eyes narrowed slightly, as if calculating Sarah's every move, measuring her worth in ways that only someone like Emma could. But instead of the usual anxiety that would have gripped Sarah in the past, there was a calm sense of assurance. Sarah knew that Emma could watch her all she wanted, but it didn't matter anymore. Emma's opinions no longer had the power to define her. Over time, Sarah began to form unexpected friendships with some of the other dancers. It wasn't that they suddenly accepted her out of pity or obligation, but rather because they recognized the sincerity in her dancing. They saw that she wasn't trying to be something she wasn't, and they admired the vulnerability and authenticity she brought to the stage. Sarah no longer felt isolated in the way she once did. She found herself surrounded by people who valued her for who she was, not what she looked like. One day, after an intense rehearsal, Sarah and a fellow dancer named Clara were sitting on the edge of the stage, catching their breath. Clara had always been kind to Sarah, but they hadn't talked much before, as the social dynamics at the academy had always been difficult to navigate. Yet, something had shifted between them. Clara turned to Sarah and said, "I've noticed how different you've been lately. You've really come into your own, you know." Sarah smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted. "There were days when I wanted to give up. I've had to fight against a lot of things, old habits, fears, doubts." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But I realized that I can't keep letting other people's opinions control me. I have to do this for myself." Clara nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I can tell. And you know what? You're inspiring. Watching you dance, the way you express yourself now, it's different. It's real. I think that's what people have been missing." Sarah's heart swelled with pride, but she quickly brushed the compliment aside. "I just want to dance. I want to be the best version of myself." Clara smiled knowingly. "You are. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." In that moment, Sarah realized something profound. The validation she had longed for had been within her all along. It wasn't the applause of others that made her a dancer, it was her passion, her resilience, and her willingness to stay true to herself. She had stopped trying to fit into a mold, and in doing so, she had found a version of herself she never knew existed. The fear of rejection, of not being good enough, had faded away, replaced by the confidence that came from embracing her own unique qualities. But Sarah's journey wasn't without its struggles. The pressure to succeed in such a demanding art form never truly went away. Each rehearsal, each performance, came with its own set of challenges. There were still days when the weight of expectations felt heavy, when the self-doubt crept back in. Yet, Sarah no longer approached those days with fear. She faced them with courage and determination, knowing that no matter what, she would continue to move forward. One of the most significant challenges Sarah faced was the upcoming audition for a prestigious company. It was the opportunity she had dreamed of since she first started dancing, the chance to prove herself on a larger stage, to finally earn a place among the best. But the audition wasn't just a technical test. It was a test of everything Sarah had learned on her journey. It was a test of her ability to trust herself, to dance without fear of judgment, to showcase the real her. The night before the audition, Sarah found herself alone in the studio once again, rehearsing the piece she would perform. The music filled the space, wrapping around her like a warm embrace. She moved through the steps with precision, but also with a sense of freedom she hadn't felt before. She wasn't just executing the movements, she was living them. For the first time, she could see the performance as a reflection of who she was, flaws, imperfections, and all. As she finished the routine, out of breath but with a sense of peace, Sarah paused and looked at her reflection in the mirror. The young woman staring back at her was different than the one who had first entered the academy. She was no longer the girl who doubted herself, the girl who tried to hide in the shadows. She was someone strong, someone capable of standing tall and dancing with purpose. She had learned to embrace her own body, her own story, and it showed in every step she took. The audition day arrived, and Sarah's nerves were still present, but they were no longer the crippling kind. Instead of worrying about how she would be perceived, she focused on the music, the movement, and the story she wanted to tell. When it was her turn to perform, Sarah stepped onto the stage with a quiet confidence that radiated from within. The judges watched her intently, their eyes tracing her every move. But Sarah didn't care about their scrutiny. She danced with everything she had, pouring all of her heart into every step, every leap, every turn. This was her moment, not to prove her worth, but to simply be herself. When she finished, there was a brief silence, followed by a round of applause. Sarah's chest swelled with emotion. She had done it. She had danced not for the approval of others, but for the love of the art and for the love of herself. In the days that followed, Sarah received the news: she had been accepted into the company. But more than the offer itself, what mattered most to her was the journey she had taken to get there. She had fought against the forces that tried to define her, had overcome her own fears and insecurities, and had emerged stronger, more confident, and more authentic than ever before. Sarah's story had come full circle. She had started out as a girl who doubted her place in ballet, unsure of her worth, but through her journey, she had discovered something far more valuable than external success: she had found herself. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. As Sarah's acceptance into the prestigious ballet company spread throughout the academy, a wave of quiet admiration began to ripple through her peers. She no longer felt like an outsider, not just because of the recognition she had earned, but because she had finally come to understand that she had always belonged. The company's offer was not just a triumph of technical skill, it was a testament to her growth as a dancer and, more importantly, as a person. Her first few weeks in the company were a whirlwind of rehearsals, performances, and new experiences. But despite the excitement, Sarah remained grounded in the lessons she had learned during her journey. She never let the success define her, rather, it was her ability to stay true to herself that continued to guide her. The pressure to conform to the industry's strict standards of beauty and perfection was ever present, but Sarah had already made her peace with those challenges. She no longer saw herself as a victim of expectations. Instead, she recognized them as obstacles that she had the power to overcome. One evening, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, Sarah found herself backstage, drenched in sweat but filled with a sense of fulfillment. She leaned against the cool wall, catching her breath, when she saw Emma approaching. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the two women were about to step into a battle neither had anticipated. Emma had always been a constant presence, a reminder of the judgment Sarah had once faced, but now, Sarah saw her differently. Emma wasn't an adversary anymore, she was a reflection of the struggle Sarah had overcome. Emma looked at Sarah with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. The last time they had spoken, their confrontation had left Emma visibly shaken. Sarah had held her ground, and Emma had retreated, but there had been no real closure between them. Tonight, however, Emma seemed different, less smug, more vulnerable. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes searching Sarah's face for any sign of weakness. "I've been watching you," Emma said, her voice quieter than usual. "And I don't get it. How are you so confident? How did you do it?" Sarah paused, taken aback by the question. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. The Emma she had known in the academy had been relentless, driven by the desire to be the best and to put others down in the process. This was a different Emma, a version of her who seemed to be grappling with something Sarah couldn't quite place. She took a deep breath before replying, "It wasn't about becoming perfect or meeting anyone else's standards. It was about realizing that I didn't need to change who I was to fit in. For so long, I tried to hide behind a mask of what I thought people wanted to see. But I learned that true strength comes from accepting yourself, flaws and all. Confidence isn't something you get from others, it's something you have to build from within." Emma's face softened slightly, as if Sarah's words had broken through some invisible barrier. "I don't know if I could do that," she admitted, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I've spent my whole life trying to be perfect, trying to prove that I'm enough. But sometimes it feels like it's never enough, you know? Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of those words. I do know, she said quietly. But I also know that the only person you need to prove anything to is yourself. If you can find peace with who you are, then everything else becomes so much easier. There was a long silence between them, and for the first time, Sarah saw Emma not as a rival or a threat, but as a person who was struggling with the same things Sarah had once struggled with. Emma's perfectionism had been her armor, but it had also been her prison. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice quieter now, almost vulnerable. Do you think it's too late for me to change? To stop caring so much about what everyone else thinks? Sarah smiled gently. It's never too late. Change doesn't happen overnight, but if you're willing to start, you'll find that it's a journey worth taking. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and Sarah saw a flicker of hope in Emma's expression. It was as if a new possibility had opened up before her. The tension that had once defined their relationship was slowly starting to dissipate, replaced by a shared understanding. As the days passed, Sarah's presence in the company grew stronger. She became more than just a dancer, she became a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of self-acceptance. Her journey had inspired others, even those who had once overlooked her or doubted her potential. One evening, after a performance that had left the audience on the edge of their seats, Sarah found herself standing backstage, reflecting on how far she had come. Her body was tired, aching from the exertion of the night's performance, but her spirit felt lighter than it had in years. She had found a new sense of balance, a harmony between her passion for ballet and her newfound sense of self-worth. The applause from the audience still echoed in her ears, but it was the quiet, internal applause that mattered most to her now. She had proven to herself that she was capable, not because of the validation of others, but because she had learned to believe in her own abilities and worth. The journey had not been easy, and there were still moments when self-doubt crept in, but Sarah had learned to quiet those voices and replace them with a steady, unwavering belief in herself. And then, just as she was about to step into her dressing room, Sarah heard someone call her name. She turned to see Emma approaching, her expression softer than Sarah had ever seen it. Thank you, Emma said, her voice sincere. For everything. I think I get it now. You were right. Sarah smiled warmly, a sense of peace settling over her. You don't need to thank me. You just have to start believing in yourself, too. As Sarah walked into her dressing room that night, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not just for the opportunities that had come her way, but for the lessons she had learned and the people she had met along the way. Her journey in ballet had become more than just about dancing, it had become about growth, self-discovery, and the courage to face the world as her authentic self. And she knew, deep in her heart, that this was only the beginning of a much greater story. The story of a woman who had found her true voice, and with it, the freedom to dance, to live, and to be exactly who she was meant to be. Months passed, and Sarah's reputation within the ballet company continued to grow. No longer the shy, insecure dancer who had struggled to find her place, she had blossomed into one of the most captivating and graceful performers the company had seen. Her presence on stage was magnetic, and it wasn't just her technique that commanded attention, it was the depth of emotion she poured into every performance. She danced not to impress, but to express, to connect with her audience in a way that felt real and raw. Her transformation had also begun to influence the culture of the company. The pressure to conform, to be a certain way, slowly started to loosen. Other dancers who had once been consumed by the pursuit of perfection began to open up to the idea that vulnerability could be as powerful as precision. They saw how Sarah's authenticity had elevated her dancing, and many started to take a hard look at their own practices, questioning whether they, too, were dancing for the right reasons. In one particular rehearsal, as the company prepared for a major performance, Sarah found herself in a conversation with one of the senior dancers, Catherine, a woman who had always been a figure of authority and poise within the company. Catherine had been a perfectionist in the truest sense, always meticulously planning every movement, controlling every aspect of her performances. But today, she seemed different, softer somehow. Catherine approached Sarah with an unexpected level of warmth and vulnerability, asking if they could talk after rehearsal. After they finished, they sat down in the quiet corner of the studio, the sound of distant chatter from the other dancers filling the air. Catherine looked at Sarah with a thoughtful expression before speaking. "I've been watching you, Sarah. How you've been dancing lately, how you've changed. It's inspiring." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat, unsure of how to respond. Catherine had always been a quiet force within the company, strong, stoic, almost unapproachable. To hear such words from her was unexpected. Catherine continued, her voice steady but carrying a hint of vulnerability. "For years, I've been chasing perfection. Every move, every line, every performance, always striving to be flawless. But lately, I've started to question whether that's really what makes a great dancer. Watching you, I've realized that maybe I've been missing something. Maybe it's not about being perfect. Maybe it's about being true to yourself, about allowing the emotions to come through, even if it means making mistakes." Sarah sat in silence, absorbing Catherine's words. She had always admired Catherine's discipline, her unparalleled technique. But now, seeing her open up in such a way, Sarah realized that even the most accomplished dancers struggled with the same pressures she had once faced. The need to be perfect, to conform, to meet expectations, they were universal struggles, not limited to her. I think I've spent too much of my life hiding behind the facade of perfection," Catherine said, her eyes softening. "You've taught me that it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to not have everything figured out." The words struck a deep chord within Sarah. She had always thought of Catherine as an unshakable figure, someone who had everything together. To hear her admit that she had struggled with the same feelings of inadequacy and doubt was both humbling and empowering. In that moment, Sarah realized that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. It was the key to unlocking true artistry. As the weeks went on, Sarah continued to dance with passion and authenticity, but now, she also began to mentor others within the company. She shared her journey, her struggles, and her triumphs with the newer dancers, encouraging them to embrace who they were and to let go of the fear of judgment. Slowly, the culture of the company began to shift. The atmosphere was no longer one of harsh competition and silent comparisons, but of collaboration, understanding, and support. Dancers who had once viewed each other as rivals began to form deeper bonds, united by their shared desire to grow and to express themselves freely. Despite her success, Sarah never forgot the challenges she had faced to get there. She often thought back to the days when Emma had fat-shamed her, when she had felt invisible, when she had believed that her worth was tied to her appearance. Those painful memories were no longer the defining moments of her life, they had simply become part of the larger story of her growth. One night, as Sarah stood in front of the mirror in her dressing room, preparing for her solo performance, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She no longer saw the girl who had once been afraid to step into the spotlight, who had been consumed by self-doubt. Instead, she saw a woman who had worked tirelessly to build herself up from the ground. The woman in the mirror was strong, confident, and at peace with who she was. As she stepped onto the stage that night, Sarah felt a sense of tranquility that she had never experienced before. The bright lights, the expectant silence of the audience, it no longer intimidated her. She was not performing for their approval. She was performing for herself. She danced with a freedom that felt limitless, her movements flowing effortlessly from one to the next. Each step, each leap, each pirouette was an expression of her soul. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She was simply dancing. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Sarah didn't need it. She knew that the real applause, the one that mattered most, was the quiet recognition she had given herself. In the months that followed, Sarah's career continued to rise, but she no longer measured her success by external accolades or praise. She measured it by her ability to stay true to herself, to dance with authenticity, and to inspire others to do the same. And as for Emma, she had come a long way too. The harsh, judgmental words that had once come so easily to her had faded, replaced by a newfound sense of empathy. She had reached out to Sarah on more than one occasion, asking for advice, not about dancing, but about how to live with authenticity. Their relationship had transformed from one of rivalry to one of mutual respect. As Sarah looked back on everything she had accomplished, she realized that the real victory had not been in earning a place in the company or receiving praise from her peers, it had been in discovering her own worth and the power of self-acceptance. She had learned that true beauty didn't come from the way she looked or the way others saw her, it came from the way she danced, from the way she embraced her flaws and imperfections, and from the courage she had found to be herself. And that, she knew, was a lesson that would stay with her for the rest of her life.